Today we continue on our series titled Open. Last week we talked about this idea of how to be open, and that being open to others involves vulnerability and courage. And we had two people, Angie and Talia, who shared their story. I know it spoke to a lot of us as well, as they were courageous and vulnerable to share a little bit about their story and what it means to open up to each other and then open up to the needs of other people. And we talked about this sense of belonging and that everyone has a need to belong. It's one of our 5 basic needs according to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Today, we're going to talk about this idea that everything and everyone belongs. And so I had a little bit of an introduction, but then I realized that my sermon was already long, so we're going to jump in for your sake, so we're not here for an hour. Because at the end, there's something that is, I found, very beneficial, and so I hope you will as well. So today we're going to draw upon the text. We're going through the book of Acts. So today we're going to talk through Acts chapter 10. And Acts 10, beginning in verse 1, through actually the next chapter, 11, verse 18, is the longest narrative in the book of Acts. So obviously the author created this in a way that this is an important, pivotal part of this book. It's the longest narrative in the whole book. And you can kind of dissect this into 2 sections. The beginning section is, or in 2 visions, more or less. The beginning part is a vision that a man named Cornelius has. And the second part is a vision that a man named Peter, who is an apostle of Jesus, has. So the first, we're going to talk a little bit about the vision of Cornelius, and then we're going to read together the vision of Peter. To begin with Cornelius, he was a Roman centurion, so he had a bit of authority. He was what the text calls a God-fearer. A God-fearer was basically a designated name for non-Jewish people who still worshiped and prayed to the Jewish God Yahweh, right? In essence, he was a non-circumcised Gentile believer, a worshiper of Yahweh. And we have lots of labels in our world today, don't we? We tend to label things and polarize things. And back then, as today, it was very common to do that as well. And one of the most common, although there was many, one of the biggest ones for the Jews, divisions, if you will, was that between Jews and Gentiles. And so here we have a Gentile named Cornelius who has a vision from God. And it says he had it at 3 p.m., which was one of the regular times of Jewish prayers. So he has this vision where this angel appears to him. Doesn't really tell him a whole lot, other than he tells him, go and speak to this man named Peter. He's located at Joppa, and he'll tell you what to do. So Cornelius has this vision, and then it just changes his life forever. He then sends out a soldier with 2 of his slaves, and he says, go find this man named Peter. The journey to Joppa was about 30 miles away. So he has this vision at 3 p.m., and then we pick up the text. It's at noon that we read that these people entered into the house of Peter. Now, has anybody ever walked 30 miles in one setting before? Or ran 30 miles? Maybe there's some really insane people. I have never walked 30 miles. But if he had the vision at 3 p.m. and then shows up the next day at 12 noon, there was an urgency there. So they walked probably much of the night to arrive at Peter's house. This was an important thing for Cornelius. And I want us to actually, we'll start actually at the text. We're going to skip the first slide, sorry. We're going to jump into the text in Acts chapter 10 together. And it starts in verse 9. So about noon the next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up to the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat. And while it was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw the heavens open and something like a large sheet coming down, being lowered to the ground by its 4 corners. In it were all kinds of 4-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. He heard a voice saying, get up, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, by no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean. The voice said to him again a second time, what God has made clean, you must not call profane. This happens 3 times, and the thing was suddenly taken up to heaven. So as as God appears to Peter, there is a sheet that falls down with many animals on the sheet, and God says, take and eat, kill and eat. Now, Peter was a good Jew, and as a good Jew, you did not eat certain animals. Certain products were considered non-kosher. So Peter, some scholars think maybe Peter saw this as a test. Like, is God testing me? No, of course, God, I'm not that kind of person. I would never. So Peter has certain things that he can and cannot eat, and it's not just a certain diet. He didn't just choose this. This is part of his identity. Does that make sense? So it's not an option for him. So this leaves Peter in a state of confusion. Like, why would God say this? Did I hear God right? What's going on here? In fact, the next verse we read that while Peter was greatly puzzled about what to make of this. So Peter's in a state of confusion. I'm not sure, did I hear God right? Is this what God said? Because I don't eat these things. These things are considered unclean. This is part of my identity as a Jewish person. And then in verse 19, while Peter was still thinking about this vision, the Spirit said to him, look, 3 men are searching for you. Now get up, go down, and go to them without hesitation, for I have sent them. So Peter still is unsure of what to make of all this. He just had a vision. He had something happen to him that was like confusing. Is this God? How do I understand this? And yet he follows God's Spirit and moves and goes to the house of Cornelius. Eventually, Peter has an aha moment where he realizes, oh, this vision isn't about what are clean and unclean animals to eat. This vision is about what is a clean and unclean person and how God sees people. So today, as we wrestle through this question, how can everything and everyone belong? Doesn't that just lead to a sort of relativism, like anything goes? Don't we need divisions in our world? But Peter has this experience where now the divisions that he had previously thought no longer exist. That Jew and Gentile, there's not clean and unclean, there's just human. And so we read, as Peter talked with Cornelius, he went in and found many assembled. And he said to them, you yourselves know that it is unlawful for a Jew to associate with or to visit a Gentile. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without objection. Now may I ask, why have you sent me? And let's read together verses 34 and 35. Then Peter began to speak to them. I truly understand that God shows no partiality. But in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. So Peter has this experience, momentary confusion, now gets it, now understands. Wait, God shows no partiality. Now, this is a beautiful and wonderful thing, wouldn't you agree? This is not a new thing. God shows no partiality. This was not a new thing. So let's read a few things together, if you will. We're going to jump down to slide 6. I'm kind of jumping around here. I apologize in the back there. But we're going to jump down to slide 6, and we're going to read Leviticus 19 together. It says, you shall not render an unjust judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. Deuteronomy 10 says, for the Lord your God is a God of gods, a Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and who loves the strangers, providing them food and clothing. Then 2 Chronicles 19, verse 7 says, now let the fear of God be upon you. Take care what you do, for there is no perversion of justice with the Lord our God, or partiality, or taking of bribes. The idea that God shows no partiality, that God was not partial, was a long existing belief within the Jewish consciousness. It wasn't a new thing. For Peter, he has an experience that opens him up to realize something that he had always believed and been taught now extends and opens up and expands to others. The idea that God shows no partiality in the Jewish consciousness of that time primarily had to do with the rich and the poor, as we read in those verses time and time again. And it was this idea that just because you're wealthy doesn't mean that you're in good with God, or that because you're rich, somehow you can bribe God by your riches, or that you were blessed by God and that's why you're rich, and if you're poor, you're cursed by God. So there's this idea that God shows no partiality if you're wealthy or if you're poor. So that idea wasn't new, but how Peter now understood that idea had grown. So he saw this in a different light. This text that we just read is often talked about and has to do with racism and prejudice in our world, which I think it's true and it's an important part. But I like to suggest it doesn't always necessarily go deep enough. We're going to jump back to slide 5. They're laughing back there. You love me, I know. Peter had an experience that I'm going to call an expanding human consciousness. Peter had an experience that expanded his consciousness. So we're going to take today an abstract idea, and we're going to try to show how it's true in several different ways, and then give us a hook at the end to place it on something concrete. Expanding human consciousness. Have you ever had an experience, maybe it's a time of prayer, maybe it's an experience with someone else, where you used to think one way and now you begin to see differently? Your consciousness was sort of expanded. And oftentimes when that happens, there's this sort of time of, I don't know how to make sense of this. Like, this thing happened, how do I make sense of this? And like Peter, we're like, I don't know, what does this mean? I saw this, I met this person, I'm not sure what this means. Perhaps you had a view of a certain religious person, like a Muslim, and you had a view that all Muslims are evil or violent, because sometimes they're portrayed that way, unfortunately, in our world. And yet you found out your neighbor was a Muslim, and you went over for dinner, and you sat down, and they were extremely generous and loving. And you had an experience now that opened you up and expanded your consciousness. What do you do with that? Or maybe you thought Christians were closed-minded, right? And then you had an experience with somebody that wasn't closed-minded. And you're like, what do I do with that? This person actually believes in science and God. How does that work? How do I make sense of that? Perhaps you thought being gay was a choice and it was a sin, and then somebody in your family or close to you came out, and you sat down and you listened to them, and you realized, wow, this is much more complicated than I thought, and I don't know how to make sense of this now. It used to be very easy to sort of divide them and say, oh, it's a choice, and that's sin, and now it's real life encounter. I had this experience that kind of opened up my consciousness, to something new. How do I make sense of this? There's different ways of looking at Scripture. There's different ways of trying to understand what the Bible is overall. And one of the helpful ways for me has been to understand that the Bible is actually a collection of books, obviously, but that it's also a collection, a history of expanding consciousness through time. And what I mean by that is, as you look back, you might find passages in the Bible that you struggle with. Like, why would God say that? Or why would they do that? Or why would they do that in the name of God, right? In parts of Scripture, there's this idea that God is basically like a geographic warrior deity that fights for your group of people, because that was the consciousness of the time. Many people in the ancient world viewed their God or their gods, their collection of gods, as sort of a geographic warrior deity that fought on their behalf. And so we see that actually come through in parts of Scripture. We also see where God caused floods or rain, and we read about that in the Bible. Many people don't view that today. I mean, I don't view like God caused this rainstorm out here that hopefully will hit us this afternoon and bring some showers and cool off, the weather. I don't view that as God causing that. Or if we have a drought, like God's mad at us. Like, I don't have that view, but they did in the ancient world. They had a view that everything was caused directly by God. So if there was a massive flood, that was caused by God. If there was a drought, that was caused by God. And yet we see in Scripture people encountering God and opening themselves up to see God differently. And I would argue even in Jesus we see not a drastically different God. We see glimpses of God throughout all of Scripture. But Jesus reveals a loving and compassionate God. Let's take a look historically, just at our nation. Everybody still with me? All right. Just at our history as a nation, 240 years. 240 years-ish ago, our nation was founded, and we brought over black people from Africa and made them our slaves. And it wasn't until 1885 where we initiated the 13th Amendment, where all black people were completely free. And we still deal with racism today. So for the first 100+ years of this nation, slavery was legal. Most of you would say that is absolutely wrong today. So somehow we've expanded our consciousness. We're in a different place than we were then. And I'm going to tiptoe around partisan politics here a little bit. Today, whether you like him or hate him, we have a black president. That would have been unheard of 50 years ago. You may disagree with him, and that's okay. I'm not trying to be partisan here, but we have a black president today. So obviously, we've grown to some extent. We have a lot of work to do. I think we would all agree. Racism is still a problem in our nation, but we've grown, we've expanded. Women weren't allowed to vote until 1920. Women were not allowed to vote in this country. That means from the moment our nation was founded until now, women were not allowed to vote more than they were allowed to vote. Still to this day, in roughly 50% of churches in America, women are not allowed to be the senior pastor. We have work to do. I do not want to raise my boys in a setting where a woman is limited by that. And I don't have any daughters, so if I did, I wouldn't want to raise my daughters there, but I don't want my sons to view that. Women have a certain role, and men have a certain role. I want them to see that there is equality here. Today, again, not to be partisan, but we have a first woman presidential nominee. And you may love her, you may hate her, and that's okay. But now we have a first woman presidential nominee, which, again, would have been unheard of like 50 years ago. Like a woman for president? So you see, even in our history, there's this growth, there's this expanse of human consciousness. But here's, I think, a very important point. With growth comes greater complexity. With growth comes greater complexity. Now, how many of you would say the world is more complex than it was when I was a young child? Right? All right, most of us. We would probably almost all say the world is more complex today than it was when I was a kid, right? Technology, we have a more globalized world, we have all this complexity coming, and yet that's a part of growth. So it makes it more complex. Sometimes it makes it more divisive at times because now there's more complexity, there's differences of opinion. So with growth comes complexity. Growth brings complexity. And we see this even in the unfolding of our universe. So I asked a person who attends here, Jen Bailey, just for a couple quick stats. Jen Bailey is compared to me like a science genius, okay? So I went to her, I was like, give me an idea of the universe. And so she gave me a couple facts that just like, I can't wrap my mind around at all. But our universe is approximately 93 billion light years in diameter. And I can't even imagine. That's just huge. And then you have people thinking, well, we might not even just have one universe. Like there might be more and multiple and who knows how many. And the universe itself is expanding. So it increases at roughly 1.96 million kilometers per second. Boom. Mind blown right there. Like, oh. So Peter has this experience where his consciousness was at a certain place, and he has this vision, and now he's opened up a little bit more. Now there's no longer Jew or Gentile. There's no longer slave or free, male or female, to quote Paul in Galatians. Now I see, yeah, God's not partial, and I've always believed it, but now I see it even more than I did before. Our nation, while it's far from perfect, we've come a long way. And historically, not just our nation, but our globe, our world. I mean, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, they viewed the world very differently than we did. We're growing, we're expanding in that direction. And the universe has, our world, our nation has, individually, we've experienced this ourselves. We're moving, we're growing. It brings, though, with it greater complexity. And I'm going to jump all the way back, just to keep the people in the back on their toes, to the very first slide. We as humans tend to create divisions and then dehumanize the other. We divide, and then we dehumanize. And we've seen this now in politics, and part of that, I think, is just expected. We've seen the Republican and the Democratic conventions, and you could argue who did it more or whatever, but we see this tendency in all of our lives. At your work, I'm sure it exists. In schools, it exists, to divide and then to dehumanize the other. Is there a way of being in the world where labels exist, but we do not dehumanize, and where yet everything and everyone belongs? And so I want to invite you to see a way of seeing, a way of understanding the world that has really helped me, and I hope it'll help you. Some of you guys might be like, oh yeah, I've heard this before. Old news. Some of you might be like, oh, I'm not sure I agree, or it doesn't make sense, and that's all right. We could talk more afterwards. But it's this idea of bounded set versus centered set thinking. So I want to invite you to look at this slide here. Bounded set thinking, basically, there's a clear line. You all see it, right? And it can be a circle, a square, a triangle. It can be any shape you would like. Here it just happens to be a circle. So there's a clear line. So we know who is in and who's out, right? It's very easy to see the people that are white, this is not always the greatest example here. The people that are shaded white are in. The people who are shaded black are out. Ironic. There is a clear in group and there is a clear out group. Sorry, I did not even notice that before when I put it up there. Now I'm really distracted. Squirrel. Anyways, in this view, we have then gatekeepers who walk alongside of that very clear line and tell people who is in and who's out. Churches often function this way. Churches have people then who tell you if you're in or if you're out. And often this comes down to doctrine or beliefs. Do you follow this 20 set checklist here? And if you don't, well, sorry, then you're out. You're not part of the in group. And then the whole mentality is to create people who are out, to bring them in, to make them think the same way that you do. That's the world that I grew up in. That's the only way I knew how to understand the world, was to make a bunch of Christians, to be honest, to make a bunch of people who thought exactly like me. And there's relatively little diversity. The only main difference in churches is like how big or small your circle is. So some people have a very, very small circle. Very few people are actually in, right? And we've seen this in our world over and over and over again. What does it mean, and what would it look like if there wasn't a line? Let's go ahead into the second slide. This is an idea, it's called centered set thinking. If we erase that line, people automatically think chaos. What happens then? Is this anything goes, right? But this is a centered set thinking. There's no line, there's no boundary. Everyone belongs, right? And as you see, there's no white people or black. Everyone's the same. Everyone is human. No religious differences, no gender biases, no orientation that is different. There's a center. And the thing is, are you moving towards that center, or are you moving away from that center? And then, of course, the question is, what is that center? And we might define that differently. So as a Christian pastor, I would probably define the center as the life and the teachings of Jesus. And even say that people can be moving towards that without even knowing or claiming Jesus. It's not the belief about Jesus that matters to me as much as it does are people walking towards the philosophy, the life, the actual way of living as Jesus taught. You could even take it a step further, I think, and say maybe the center is love. And I know love sounds kind of foo-foo again, and it's hard to always define. But Jesus taught us that God is love. Jesus taught love is the thing that holds everything else together. It's the core issue. Do we love God? Do we love ourselves? Do we love our neighbor? Do we love our enemy? And then people that say, oh, that's just so easy. It's not easy. Loving others is absolutely the most difficult thing. And then you start widening that circle and saying, oh, I love my enemies too. How do I do that? That's hard. That's hard. So then there is a way to think, oh, everyone belongs, right? There's not an in or an out group. For a while, for me, I grew up again with the bounded set. And then when that line began to erase, I began to see, oh, there's Christians that I know that seem to be moving away from love. Right? There's Christians I know that seem to be very judgmental and not loving. And then there's people I knew of different religious or non-religious, atheists, agnostics, that seem to be moving towards love. And what do I do with that? And so it took me for a while of just kind of confusion. I think I was like Peter. I was like, how do I make sense of this? I don't understand. How do I make a world where everyone belongs? And it's not about getting people to come in and excluding others and saying, you're out. But then it becomes more about myself moving towards that center, right, of love and the life of Jesus, and encouraging others, inspiring others to move towards that center. Does this make sense to you? Hopefully it's helpful in that there's no divisions. And yeah, we have differences. I'm a male, right? I'll always be a male as far as I can tell in the foreseeable future, right? And yet, it doesn't matter if you're male, female, black, white, what skin color, what your orientation is. The simple question, are you moving towards that or away from that? And that gives us then the freedom to point out love and truth and beauty and goodness wherever we see that, in whomever we see that in. And it's not about making that person come into my circle, right? It's about pointing out the love that I see in them, the beauty that I see in them, encouraging that, maybe even learning from that as we all move towards the center.